Imagine walking through the library, not browsing, not searching, just walking. The way you do when you already know where you're going and the rest of the building is just there. A parent has a kid with him, 6, maybe 7. The kid's got that specific gravity that little kids get when they're near something they love. This leaning forward, half jogging pull toward the picture book section. And the dad, well, maybe mother. Well, they just kind of drift along. Phone half out of his pocket. Mind 3 tasks ahead of this one. They pass the new release table. Glance doesn't stop. They pass the section about the paperback thrillers, the ones with the silver titles and a single ominous object on the cover, a knife, a house, a woman's back turned to you. They almost stop there. Almost. There's a title they recognize from a podcast. He makes a mental note. The kind of mental note that evaporates in about 4 minutes and keeps walking. Then they hit the kids section and the kid takes off. Actually takes off. Sneakers squeaking on that weird library target that somehow is both scratchy and slippery at the same time. Straight toward a low shelf packed with fat, worn out hardcovers. Cinderella, The Frog Prince, something with a wolf on the spine, teeth bared, drawn in that soft color style that's supposed to make it less scary and never actually does. Beauty and the Beast, a version with gold foil lettering, half rubbed off from 1,000 small hands, doing exactly what this kid's hands are about to do. The dad smiles, a genuine smile. There's nothing performative about it. This is a parent who's happy their kid loves reading, happy their kid is excited about something that isn't a screen. Happy in the uncomplicated way you're happy when something good is happening right in front of you. And he does not look at the shelf. Not once. Not really. Like, his eyes pass over the spines the way your eyes pass over furniture in a room you've lived in for 10 years. Present, accounted for, completely invisible. He's not being dismissive. He's not thinking, oh, that's just kid stuff. He's not thinking at all. That's the part that matters, though. There's no active judgment happening. There's no contempt. There's just invisibility. The shelf has become part of the architecture of childhood. The same category as the ball pit or the bin of dress-up costumes. Something your kid walks towards and then you walk away from. Back to the actual books, the ones for actual adults, the ones on the other side of the building where the real stories live. They wait by a chair near the window, pull out the phone, and the kid sits cross-legged on the floor, already 3 pages into something, mouthing the words silently. Completely gone, completely somewhere else. Inside a forest, a curse, a trial that ends either in transformation or ruin. 10 minutes later, they check out 4 books. 2 picture books about a diplodocus for the dad's own memory of his childhood animal obsession, and 2 fairy tales, one of which is missing its dust jacket and smells like a basement. The librarian scans them without looking up. It's a Tuesday. This happens 40 times a day in this building alone. Nobody in that scene did anything wrong. Nobody was cruel to a story. Nobody insulted a book. It's just one of the oldest storytelling traditions in human history got filed under things we grow out of. And an adult who reads thrillers and watches TV and probably has opinions about structure walked right past it without a flicker of recognition. And that's the problem. Okay, so the parents are not the villain. The parents are basically all of us. And this is what annoys me, like genuinely annoys me, because I don't think we do this on purpose. I don't think there was a meeting where humanity decided fairy tales are for children now. Everyone signed the form. It just sort of happens. Slowly, over a couple hundred years of publishers and moralists and Victorian parents deciding these stories needed softening, needed a nursery, needed a for ages 4 and 8 sticker slapped to the spine. And once the sticker's there, something weird happens in the brain. You stop reading it as a story and start reading it as an artifact. Like it's a fossil, like it's cute. Like it's the narrative equivalent of a onesie you keep in a drawer for sentimental reasons. And meanwhile, every single one of us is out here consuming fairy tale logic constantly, all day, every day, and we don't clock it once because it's not wearing the costume anymore. It took off the crown and the talking wolf and put on a hoodie. Because you'll have a creator, a writer, filmmaker, game designer, doesn't matter, pick your medium, sitting there, stuck on a story, staring at a blank page or a blank timeline going, I need something original, something nobody's done before. And of course, they'll say the sentence while sitting 4 feet away from a bookshelf containing 4,000 years of humanity's battle-tested narrative tech. And they won't glance at it. Some walk past, some invisible shelf, but a different building. I don't know why this is a thing, but we treat inherited and unoriginal as if they're the same word. They're not. They're not even close. So let me explain what I mean, because this is the part where people nod along without actually letting it land. There was this researcher, Vladimir Propp, a Russian who did his work in the 1920s. And what he did was take a huge pile of Russian folklore and break it down to their skeletons. Not the surface, not the there was a witch or there is a forest, but the actual functional bones underneath. He landed on 31 reoccurring narrative functions. Things like a hero is tested, a magical agent gets received, the villain is defeated, the hero is marked in some way. There's a false hero who tries to claim the reward. The truth is out. Restoration happens. 31 functions. Written down about 100 years ago, based on stories that are thousands of years older than that. And here's the thing. You can lay that skeleton over Star Wars and it fits. Hunger Games and it fits. Succession and it fits. Because the villain isn't a witch and the magical agent is just a share of company stock. And the false hero is whatever Roy's sibling thinks they won the episode. Same bones, completely different skin. That's the part that should stop you cold, and it usually doesn't. Because we're so locked into thinking fairy tales as content, as a genre, as a section of the bookstore, instead of what they actually are, which is closer to grammar, a language. You don't outgrow grammar. You just stop noticing you're using it. Here's what gets me, though. it's not that we, it's not even that we use fairy tale structure without noticing. That alone would be interesting enough for a whole video and we could all go home. But it's that we use it while actually believing we've moved past it. Like, there's a specific flavor of creator, and okay, I've been this creator, not throwing stones here, who prides themselves on being submersive, on deconstructing tropes, on being too smart for the obvious beats of fairy tale lore. And then you look at their actual work, and it's got a chosen figure, an ordinary world that gets disrupted, a mentor who dies or disappears at the exact moment to force growth, a symbolic trial, a transformation, a return. Every box checked. And they call it grounded instead of magical. And somehow that word alone convinces them they escaped the pattern. You didn't escape the pattern, you just didn't recognize it. Which gets treated the same as originality. And it is not the same. So in real life, this shows up everywhere the second you start actually looking for it. Like, in places that have nothing to do with fiction at all. Like escape rooms, for example. Nobody walks into an escape room going, ah, yes, a fairy tale. You pay $40 to get locked into a converted office space with your coworkers and solve puzzles or whatever. But strip the theme off and look at the shape. An ordinary person enters a strange sealed off space. There are trials, symbolic ones usually, a lock that needs a specific combination of moral effort to crack, not brute force. You gain tools along the way that function exactly like a magical agent in Propp's framework. An object given to you because you prove yourself worthy of it in a small test. There's a final obstacle. There's an escape. And you leave transformed. At least for the length of the group photo, standing there going, we did it! High on the exact emotional cocktail that every fairy tale hero gets at the end of the trial. Nobody built the escape room industry by reading Propp. They built it by instinct, because that structure feels satisfying to a human nervous system in a way that's hardwired at this point. That part should be fascinating to all of us, because it's not storytellers that are copying fairy tales on purpose. It's fairy tale logic so deeply ingrained in us that entire industries are built around it by accident or on purpose, if you think about it. And it's interesting because once you see it in escape rooms, it shows up everywhere. That, well, it shows up in even places that are not looking like a fairy tale, like the exact opposite. So look at the glow up content. I'm talking the fitness transformations, room makeovers, the whole genre of watch me become a different person over 90 days. Everyone involved would tell you this is the least fairy tale thing imaginable, because it's authentic, it's real. There's a spreadsheet involved, there's a before and after specifically chosen. And what gets me and what gets me is that specific choice, every time I've seen someone do this, is basically doing the same emotional work as Cinderella. Like, you need a low point to be visible, so low that the transformation registers as magic. the godmother is just a personal trainer or a mentor figure in the comments, or an algorithm that surfaced the right video at the right moment and gets credited in a caption like a supernatural benevolent force. The algorithm blessed me with the sound and it changed my life. Those people actually type sentences like that, completely unironically, and nobody clocks that they just described a fairy godmother using tech bro vocabulary. That's the thing, though. Cinderella never went anywhere. She just has an Instagram account now. Okay, so I want to sit in this for a little bit longer instead of just cruising through examples like it's a highlight reel. Because that's where people usually bail in this kind of discussion. They collect the fun parallels and they miss what it actually implies, which is a little bit more than interesting. See, if the structure is that deeply embedded, that automatic, that load-bearing in how humans process change and danger and reward, then originality, the thing every creator online is white-knuckling their way toward, might not mean what we think it means. And the fact that most people chasing originality or actually chasing novelty, it's like those are not the same target. Novelty is the surface. It's the nobody has done a heist movie set on the moon before. Structure is underneath that. Invisible, of course, but it's doing the actual labor. And it's frequently the exact same skeleton as a story that's 4,000 years old. There's a phrase that gets thrown around a lot in writing advice content, and it drives me a little crazy. There's no new stories, only new ways to tell them. No. Like, what gets me is everyone nods at that phrase and goes right back to panicking about originality like they never understood it. And it's become one of those things creators say to sound wise in the comment section, and then completely ignore in their actual process. Because saying it is comforting and believing it requires you to change how you think about your work. And we all know that is, well, not the best, easiest way to go about things. Anyway, like, I don't think fairy tales limit creativity. It's actually the opposite. And I know that's a safe thing to say in a video like this. Sounds like something with a nice little bow on it. But stay with me because I don't mean it in the soft way. I mean it as a genuine claim. When creators avoid fairy tale structure because it feels beneath them, they're not protecting their originality. They're cutting themselves off from thousands of years of stress testing. Every trope inside a fairy tale got refined across centuries of retelling in front of a live audience, in cultures with wildly different values, surviving translation, surviving religious upheaval, the printing press even, colonization, surviving Disney. Of course I can't say that. I can't have this video without saying that. But anyway, so that's not a weakness. It's the most rigorously workshopped material in the history of storytelling, and creators are avoiding it because it's shelved next to picture books of a friendly Diplodocus. And it's so backwards. It's almost hilarious. Except it's also why a huge number of creators are sitting there stuck, insisting they need something nobody's ever done, while ignoring the entire toolkit built specifically to solve the problems they're stuck on. And it's what annoys me about the way originality gets talked about in creator spaces generally. Like, there's this myth, and it's a persistent one, that the goal is to invent something with zero ancestry. No influences you can point to, no visible skeleton, pure invention from nothing. And that goal is not just difficult, it's unrealistic. It doesn't exist. It has never existed. Nobody has ever made a story with zero inherited structure, because stories aren't made in a vacuum. They're made by brains that grew up steeped in other stories. And pretending otherwise is just originality theater. Here's what where I think people get confused, though. And I want to be fair to the other side for a sec, because there's a real counter argument here. And it goes like this. Maybe these patterns don't come from fairy tales specifically at all. Maybe humans across cultures, completely independent, developed similar story shapes because they were all dealing with the same basic stuff: fear, loss, love, sacrifice, transformation, terror of the unknown, where a forest is either literal or metaphorical. And from that angle, fairy tales aren't the source of these patterns. They're just one of the many places those patterns happen to get written down. Multiple civilizations, no shared publishing industry. And yet, you get flood myths and trickster figures and transformation stories showing up independent on basically every continent inhabited. And that's a real phenomenon. Like, comparative mythologies built entire academic careers on that observation alone. And I mean, it's a fair point, and I also want to say that it does not undercut what I'm saying. It refines it. Like, even if fairy tales aren't the singular origin of these patterns, they have become one of the most efficient storage systems humans have ever built for preserving the patterns across generations. Before mass literacy, before the printing press, before the internet, a fairy tale was portable, memorable, and transmissible almost entirely through oral repetition. And that's an extraordinary piece of cultural engineering, whether anyone engineered it on purpose or not. Which is crazy, because think about what that actually requires. Like, a story has to survive being told badly. It has to survive a tired parent skipping half the details at bedtime. It has to survive a translation into a dozen different languages with a dozen different value systems. It has to survive some really weird historical detours, like the Grimms softening things for bourgeois German audiences, Perrault adding morals in verse for the French court, and even a mouse-eared media conglomerate deciding which parts stay and which parts get cut entirely. After all of that, after 4,000 years, the skeleton is still recognizable. It's not coincidence. It's a structure so functionally sound. It survived everything completely intact. And honestly, I don't know a modern piece of IP that's built to survive 4,000 years, let alone 4 years. So, this is where it falls apart for a lot of creators. And I mean that as a specific failure point, not a vibe. So, creators encounter fairy tale structure, recognize it, and then treat recognizing the pattern as the finish line. Like, once you know, oh, this is the hero's journey, or this is a Beauty and the Beast style story, you've done the work. You slap the label on and move forward, mentally checking boxes. Ordinary world, call to adventure, mentor. Like you're filling out a form instead of a story. And we all know how much of a pet peeve that is for me. Because it produces the most flattest, lifeless version of fairy tales imaginable. It produces content that feels hollow because the creator engaged with the skeleton and skipped the muscles. And that's a crime, by the way. Like a legit crime. Not using fairy tale structure. Okay, it's not a, you're gonna go to jail crime, although sometimes I kind of wish people would. Some people. Anyway, I regress. I digress. Like, not using fairy tale structure, but using it without understanding why it worked in the first place. Because in a real fairy tale, the hero isn't just tested and wins. The test means something specific to the values of whoever's telling it. The forest isn't just an obstacle, it's the unknown. Specifically, the place outside the village where a different kind of logic applies. The stepmother isn't just an antagonist, she's often doing the work of processing genuinely fraught feelings about scarce resources in a family. Feelings too dangerous to say out loud in a culture that just went through a famine. So the story does it symbolically instead. So when creators strip out the meaning and keep the shape, it's basically a hollow fairy tale costume. And audiences know that hollowness. It's a fake deep feeling. It's a reason a lot of chosen one narratives now feel empty, even when they're technically hitting every beat. The beats are there, the meaning underneath got left on the cutting room floor. Like, in online writing advice, specifically, use the hero's journey, here's a 17-step checklist, is completely divorced from the question of what the trial is actually supposed to represent for your specific story, your audience, your cultural moment. It's fairy tale cosplay, bones with nothing underneath, which is a problem, and it's also not even the most uncomfortable layer of all this. Because here's what happens once you start noticing this pattern instead of operating outside of fiction entirely. In places that have nothing to do with storytelling as a craft at all. Take genealogy sites, ancestry, 23andMe, all of it. People don't sign up to these things because they want a spreadsheet of births and year, of names and years. That's not the product being sold. What they want and what the marketing knows and is built entirely around is a hidden story, a secret ancestor, a forgotten branch of a family tree that explains something about who you are now. You've always felt different and now you know why. You're descended from Vikings, from a survivor of something enormous. That's not genealogy. It's a lost heritage fairy tale applied to your actual DNA. And it's one of the most successful consumer product categories of the last 15 years, precisely because it plugs directly into the same emotional wiring as the servant girl who was secretly a princess all along. Of course, none of these companies call it a fairy tale in the boardroom, but the emotional architecture of the product is Cinderella's arc running on a saliva sample. Or look at how these companies tell their own founding stories. Every tech company's origin myth follows the identical shape. A determined visionary, a garage, impossible odds, a moment of breakthrough nobody saw coming, eventual triumph against a skeptical world. It doesn't matter even if it's true. A lot of these stories get smoothed and, well past what actually happened. And everybody kind of just knows it and buys it anyway. Because the shape is doing the emotional work, independent of the facts. Customers aren't buying a product when they buy into a brand's origin story. They're buying the familiar transformation narrative. One they've been primed to trust since childhood. When somebody read them a story about a pauper who became something more. And this same structure is the exact one populist political movements reach for across ideological lines. The outsider hero. The corrupt establishment cast as the wicked witch or the cruel king. The corrupt. The dark forest language used for anything framed as chaotic or threatening. Immigration. Media. The economy. Whatever the villain of the week happens to be. Draining the swamp is fairy tale language. They don't want you to know the truth is fairy tale language. It's the trope of hidden knowledge only the hero can access. Politicians across the entire spectrum reach for fairy tale scaffolding because it works on a level that's older and deeper than policy positions, and audiences respond to the shape frequently before they processed a single actual argument inside. So now it's not a fun little cultural parallel anymore, is it? It's a mechanism people actually use to move power. And it works specifically because most of the population has been trained since childhood to trust this narrative shape without questioning. And then told as adults that the training wheels are off and they outgrown needing to think about it critically. And that's not a coincidence. At least I don't think so. I think a culture that stops actively, critically engaging with its foundational stories, the ones that they now file for kids, stops rereading them, stops interrogating them, well, it's a culture that's more vulnerable to having the same structure used against it by people who understand exactly how powerful it still is. The scholars, the person, the actual field of adults who studies this never stopped taking fairy tales seriously. It's just the general public that quietly checked it out. And then checked out of the stories. And there's something worth sitting in that fact. That the people who benefit most from the population checking out of fairy tales are frequently the ones most fluent in deploying it. And of course, I don't want to oversell into some grand conspiracy, because it isn't. Nobody's running a secretive fairy tale department. It's simpler and honestly worse than that. It's just an unintended structure. Nobody's guarding it. Nobody's teaching it past age 8. And it sits there fully loaded, available to absolutely anyone willing to pick it up and use it. Whether that's a novelist, a game designer, or a guy running for office. The actual scholarly fight under all of this is so much more interesting than the fairy tales are secretly everywhere surface read that most content settles for. At least on this topic. Like, there is an ongoing disagreement between two people who basically built the modern academic studies of fairy tales, and their disagreements aren't small. Like Bruno Bettelheim argues, and this is huge because it shapes how a whole generation thought about children's literature, that fairy tales, even the violent ones, the ones with mothers who try to kill their own kids and witches who get shoved into ovens, are psychologically necessary. Like, his whole argument is that kids process real existential terror through symbolic form. A child can't consciously articulate fear of abandonment, but that same one can absolutely sit with a story about being left in a forest. And that symbolic distance is what makes the fears survivable. Soften the story actually robs the kids of the tool. Now, Jack Zipes, on the other hand, and Zipes is still writing, still actively criticizing, he takes a much harder line against commercialized fairy tales specifically. His argument is that Disney and mass media generally has sanitized and commodified a tradition that used to be submersive, communal, genuinely dark, and often a vehicle for social critique. Stories told by peasants, by women, by people without other forms of power, encoding real complaints about real conditions. And in his view, turning that into a marketable, clean up product with a merch line isn't preservation. It's kind of theft. Stripping the danger strips the function. But here's something that's actually useful for creators, although buried underneath all of that academic argument. They're both right. And the tension between them is the actual story worth telling. See, Bettelheim's right that darkness serves as a psychological purpose. Sanitize it too much and you lose the thing that makes it useful. Zipes is right that commercialization tends to flatten exactly the parts that made these stories dangerous and communal and honest. And if you're a creator working with fairy tale logic today, that's not a footnote. That's your actual creative decision point every single time. How dark do you go? What do you sand off, and what does sanding it off actually cost you? Most creators don't even ask that question. They just default to the safest, softest, most marketable version that's the version they grew up with. And then they wonder why the retelling feels toothless. Because even this Disney sanitized everything narrative, which gets repeated constantly, of course, isn't quite as clean as people think. See, Disney didn't invent the happy ending. The Grimms had already been softening older, darker variants for bourgeois 19th century audiences. Decades before Disney existed. Perrault did the same thing in France in the 17th century. Disney didn't start the sanitizing. They just industrialized it. Accelerated a process that was already 300 years deep by the time the mouse showed up. Which means, and I kind of cried when I researched this, means the original, dark, authentic version people love to invoke when they're being edgy about fairy tale retellings itself, well, is just an earlier stage of the exact same softening process, not some pure, untouched source text. There's no pristine original at the bottom of this. It's softening all the way down, generation after generation, each one telling itself it's finally reaching the true version. So, in real life, what actually happens when creators try to engage with this on purpose? Well, it's generally mixed. And I want to be honest where it goes good and where it goes bad. Because both happen constantly, and the internet only talks about one of them. So, when it goes right, you have something like The Bloody Chamber by Angela Carter. Stories that take the exact same skeletons and refuse to sand off the parts that make them uncomfortable, actively pushing into the sexual, violent undercurrents the Victorian versions worked so hard to bury. You have Marisa Meyer's Lunar Chronicles taking Cinderella and putting her into a cyborg body in a sci-fi setting, which sounds like a gimmick until you realize the glass slipper doesn't fit problem is literal. Her mechanical foot doesn't match, and suddenly the old symbol has new teeth. You get Helen Oyemi's boy, Snowbird, talking about Snow White and running it through American racial politics, using the fairest of them all mirror obsession to interrogate colorism directly, which is a genuinely upsetting and necessary use of that specific structure. See, these work because the creators didn't just borrow the shape. They understood what the shape originally was doing emotionally and pointed that at something current and urgent. And then you get horror. Oh, fairy tales and horror have basically never been separated. Honestly. Like Hansel and Gretel is a story about starving parents abandoning their kids in a forest to be eaten by a cannibalistic witch. That's not horror adjacent. That's horror wearing a bonnet. But modern horror keeps proving the DNA is still active. The Babadook is functionally a Bluebeard-shaped story about grief you can't outrun locked inside your own house. Hereditary runs on the exact inherited curse passed through the bloodline engine that shows up constantly in old tales. Sins of the family structure. Except, instead of a spinning wheel, it's a genuinely disturbing family tree. Like Harry Potter, perchance? Cyrus's family tree. Anyway. Moving on. See, these work specifically because horror is a genre that never got the softening treatment the fairy tales did. It kept the teeth. But then you get the other versions, and it happens way more often than the good one, honestly. You get the dark reimagining that mistakes darkness for depth. Add trauma, add blood, add a rope. That nobody asked for. Call it mature. And skip the actual psychological, cultural work the original violence was doing. Like, that's not necessary darkness that Bettelheim was doing. That's just aesthetic darkness cosplay, using shock as a substitute for meaning that the shock is supposed to be attached to. And audiences, even when they can't name it, toss it in the bin for, well, obvious reasons. That's the fake deep alarm going off. Like, same as the Hollow Journey checklist. Just wearing a different costume. A different genre. And that's a mistake I keep seeing over and over in every medium. Treat fairy tale logic like a genre aesthetic you can slap on top of a story instead of a structural language you actually have to understand before you're allowed to bend it. You can absolutely subvert these patterns. You can go darker or lighter or completely invert who the villain is. Maleficent does exactly that. Took the Wicked Witch and gave her an actual motivating grievance. Made the hero Prince a footnote. And it worked, at least emotionally, because it understood what it was subverting instead of just performing subversion as a vibe. And it's true across every medium doing this right now, by the way. Like, it's not just a book thing. Like, look at The Witcher and what it does with fairy tale logic in the game space. Constantly forcing you to make the moral choice a fairy tale presents cleanly. Except every option is compromised, which itself was a commentary on how tidy the original moral choices usually are. Like Disco Elysium running a detective noir structure straight through a fractured psyche using archetypal figures is basically fairy tale adjacent. The shame, the fear, the ambition personified and given a voice, like something out of a reading of an old tale. Like The Path. Oh, look at The Path. It's a game that takes Red Riding Hood and just refuses to allow the player to resolve it in a safe way, forcing them to sit in the danger the original story used to represent before it got sanded down to the stay on this path, dear. None of those are writers in the traditional sense. Game designers, building interactive systems, and they're fluent in the same grammar. Because grammar isn't medium specific. It never was. What gets interesting is when you start asking what it means that the structure is stable, but the politics running through it are completely fluid. And it's this part that should really unsettle you if you're a creator. The same storytelling shape that can be told as passive girl waits patiently and gets rescued by a prince, virtue rewarded, don't make waves, your suffering will be noticed eventually if you're good enough. Well, it's deeply conservative, deeply patient, deeply about waiting your turn. Or it can be told as a girl outsmarts every system built to keep her small and claims what is rightfully hers, which is a completely different message. Maybe an opposite one, wearing an identical skeleton. Structure doesn't come preloaded with politics. You load the politics in when you tell it. Which means every time a creator reaches for fairy tale logic without thinking about it, without asking what values are actually riding underneath the shape they've inherited, they're not being neutral. They're defaulting, and default, historically, tends to skew toward whatever values were dominant when the version they grew up with got written down. Which, of course, for most Western creators means whatever Grimm's, Perrault, or mid-century Disney story department decided was appropriate for the historical audience they were never actually a part of. And that's kind of the uncomfortable implication sitting underneath all of it. It's not just that you're inheriting a structure. You're inheriting the politics that got baked into the version that you happen to absorb first. Usually before you were old enough to critically evaluate any of it. Usually from a corporation whose incentive was selling tickets to a specific demographic in a specific decade. Except, here's where it stops being slightly grim because fluidity cuts in both directions. Like, if the politics are genuinely detachable from the structure, Well, that means the structure is available to absolutely anyone who wants to load different values into it. That's what feminist retellings are doing. That's what Maleficent's doing. That's what 100 different modern creators are doing right now without calling it that. Taking a shape everyone already trusts on a gut level and quietly rewiring it, arguing for underneath. You don't have to invent a brand new emotional shape to make a genuinely radical piece of work. You can take a skeleton 4,000 years old and just change what it's fighting for. It might actually be more effective than inventing something new from scratch, because the audience already trusts the shape before you said a single word. Because even the most self-aware, ironic, we all know this is a fairy tale, wink wink, content can still, well, actually no. It can't escape the gravity of structures. Like, look at Shrek. Look at Once Upon a Time. Entire pieces of media built specifically around mocking, subverting, and deconstructing fairy tale tropes. An orc instead of a prince. The princess who'd rather stay green and gross than conventionally beautiful. Fairy tale characters trapped in a mundane modern town. And every single one of those jokes only works because the audience originally knows the shape so well to recognize what's being twisted. You can't parody a structure the audience doesn't recognize. Shrek is fairy tale adjacent in the most literal sense possible. It's a parasite on audience familiarity with the exact tradition it's pretending to reject. Which means, ironically, the whole we're too smart for this stuff now storytelling isn't actually escaping the fairy tale. It's proof the fairy tale is still fully operational underneath. Because you can't mock a dead language. The joke only lands because everyone in the room is still fluent. And this is the part where I think the whole fairy tales are mimetic thing stops being a fun academic phrase and starts actually explaining why something uncomfortable about information is not just in stories. Like, fairy tales survived because, well, no, not because they're true, and not because some council of elders decided they were culturally important and mandated their preservation. They survive because they're sticky. Like, icky sticky, cultural sticky, easy to remix, easy to tell, and retell slightly wrong, and have still work. Like, there's a virus actually that's a virus's actual definition of success. Not true, not accurate, replication. And once you see fairy tales operating on that logic, you start seeing the same replication running underneath a huge amount of what goes viral now, completely outside of fiction. Urban legends do this. The Vanishing Hitchhiker is a story that shows up in some form across dozens of cultures and decades. A driver picks up a stranger vanishes partway through the ride, and it turns out later the stranger died on the exact road years earlier. The details rotate all the time. Highway instead of forest path, car instead of a horn-drawn cart, but the function's identical to a traditional cautionary tale. packaged uncertainty, danger, and a moral warning into something so memorable it survives being retold badly at some cousin's birthday party. See, we didn't stop inventing folklore. We just stopped calling it that because folklore sounds old-timey. And we like to think of ourselves as past that. So in real life, what ends up happening is we invent new folklore constantly. Slender Man, missing 411 stories, half of true crime podcast culture, modern conspiracy theories. Well, most of them. Like using the exact emotional engineering, and we call it internet culture instead of folklore because that phrase, internet culture, sounds more modern. And we've decided modern things can't possibly be doing what the old stuff was. Same mechanism, new packaging. Nobody clocks it because the packaging is doing its job. Even AI is doing this now. And it may be the part that should bother creators the most because it's happening in real time and nobody's actually talking about it. Like, look at what people actually type into an image generator or a writing prompt when left to their own instincts. A hero, a mysterious forest, a cursed kingdom, an unlikely traveler discovers a hidden world. People reach for this vocabulary constantly, completely unprompted, as if it's the default setting for story itself. And it is the default setting, functionally, because that vocabulary is the deepest, most worn in collective human imagination that we have access to. Like, the technology is brand new, but the instinct behind what people ask is not new at all. It's the oldest instinct we have. We built a machine capable of generating literally anything, completely unconstrained by any of the old rules. And the very first thing huge amounts of people do with that freedom is ask for a fairy tale. And that should tell you something about how deep this actually goes. It's not a stylistic preference. It's closer to the shape thought takes when a person is asked to imagine a story with zero constraints. We don't invent the shape. We inherited it. And we inherited it so completely that even facing a tool with infinite creative possibilities, most people's imagination still walks straight back to the forest. Oh, right, the library. The guy walking past the shelf, or the parent. So I keep coming back to them because I don't think they're dumb and I don't think they're careless. I think they're just fluent in a language they don't know they speak. And fluency does something strange to attention. Like you stop noticing the grammar the second you can use it without thinking. Nobody consciously studies the syntax of their own language while ordering coffee. It's just there, running in the background, doing the invisible work. Fairy tale logic's completely that for most people. Invisible. You don't see it because you're too busy living inside it. And more than any individual example that I mentioned today, well, what I can't get past is that these are just symptoms. The real thing underneath is that our culture developed one of the most sophisticated storytelling techniques in human history. Refined it over thousands of years and dozens of civilizations, and then, somewhere in the last 150 or so, quietly decided it belonged in a section of the library reserved for people who can't tie their own shoes yet. And everyone just agreed. nobody voted on it. It just became the way things are, which is how a lot of the worst cultural decisions become true. By nobody bothering to argue against it while it happened. And I'm sorry, but that's just a genuinely bad thing. Like, we've got convenience, a tidy shelf, a clear age range, a clear category, and we gave up active engagement with a system that shapes how we understand danger, transformation, justice, hope, and left that system sitting there, fully functional, mostly unguarded, available to absolutely anyone willing to pick it up. Marketers picked it back up. Populist movements picked it back up. AI users picked it back up without meaning to. The people writing prestige television definitely picked it back up, whether or not they'd admit it in an interview, because basically everyone kept using the language. We just stopped teaching each other to actually read it critically past the age of 8, and then act shocked when the people most influent in deploying it are the ones with something to sell. And now, people are treating grounded and realistic storytelling like proof they've moved past the old mythic stuff. When a lot of time, it's just fairy tale structure, wearing better tailoring, which is kind of funny, actually, in a way that's not funny at all. Anyway, so yeah, that's kind of where I'm at with it. I keep picturing that shelf, picturing all of us walking past it, not looking, assuming we already know what's on it. We don't. Most of us really don't. Anyway, that's kind of the problem, isn't it? Alright, so if this made you think, like the video, subscribe if you want more stuff like this. This is WriteSparky, and I will see you in the next one.